Pretend you're our mama." The whisper was a ghost in the quiet room, a sound so small it was nearly lost beneath the crackle of the hearth fire and the rhythmic pull of her needle through coarse wool. Ilara froze, her fingers pinching the thick fabric of the fisherman's coat she was mending. The words had come from the doorway, a threshold she always kept closed against the evening chill that crept in from the sea, but it was open now. A sliver of grey twilight bled into the warm, flickering light of her small cottage. In that sliver stood 3 children. They were impossibly clean for the muddy lanes of Oakhaven, dressed in fine wool coats the color of deep forest moss. 2 boys and a girl, their faces pale and perfect like porcelain dolls, their eyes enormous and dark with a shared, solemn sorrow. They could not have been more than 5 years of age. Triplets, she thought, with a pang that was sharp and sudden, a familiar phantom limb aching for a body she had lost. She had lived in this village for 5 years, a widow who called herself Mrs. Elise. She kept to herself, earned her keep with her needle, and nursed a grief so vast and deep it had become the very architecture of her soul. No one in Oakhaven knew she was the Duchess of Blackwood, a woman who had been declared unstable, a danger, a ghost who had conveniently vanished on her way to a private asylum. A woman who had left behind 3 6-month-old infants in a cold, cavernous nursery. Her children, the thought was a blade turning in her heart. She saw them in her dreams, featureless babies swaddled in lace and regret. She imagined them growing up with a string of sterile nannies, their lives dictated by the cold, magnificent man who was their father, Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, the man who had listened to lies, who had looked at her with eyes full of terror and revulsion, and who had signed the papers that had condemned her. Now, 3 children who looked like they belonged in that world of lace and marble were standing in her doorway, asking her to be their mother. The irony was a physical sickness, rising in her throat like bile. One of the boys, the one who had spoken, took a hesitant step inside. He had a smudge of dirt on his cheek, a small rebellion against his otherwise pristine appearance. "Please," he whispered again, his voice trembling, "just for a little while." The little girl, her dark curls escaping from under her bonnet, clutched a small, worn wooden bird. She looked at Ilara with an unnerving intensity, her gaze a mirror of the one Ilara saw in her own cracked looking-glass each morning. The other boy remained a step behind, his thumb tucked into his mouth, his eyes wide and wary. Ilara's mind, usually a fortress of disciplined sorrow, fractured. For 5 years she had survived by cauterizing memory, by treating the past as a foreign country to which she could never return. She had built a wall of mending and solitude, brick by painful brick. These children were a battering ram, and her wall was turning to dust. She slowly placed the heavy coat and her needlework on the small table beside her chair. Her hands were rough now, the nails short and practical, the fingertips calloused. Nothing like the pale, smooth hands of a duchess. She rose, her body stiff from hours of sitting. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. "I am Arthur," said the first boy, with a touch of formal gravity that was both heartbreaking and absurd in one so small. "This is Beatrice, and that is Leo." Arthur, Beatrice, Leo, the names she had whispered into the darkness of her lonely bed for 5 years. The names she and Alistair had chosen together in a rare moment of shared, hopeful intimacy before the world had come crashing down. The room tilted, the firelight blurred, her breath caught in her lungs, a painful, jagged thing. These were not just any children. These were not a cruel trick of fate or a figment of her grieving imagination. They were hers. Her gaze darted past them through the open door, searching the deepening twilight for a sign, a carriage, a nursemaid, a duke. The lane was empty, save for a swirl of autumn leaves dancing in the wind. They were alone. How could they be here, in this forgotten corner of the coast, so far from the grandeur of Blackwood Manor? Beatrice took a step forward, holding out the little wooden bird. "Papa says Mama is a star in the sky," she said, her voice clear and sweet as a bell. "But you are not a star. You are warm." Ilara's legs gave way. She sank to her knees on the rough-hewn floorboards, the scratch of the wood a distant sensation. Warm. For 5 years, she had been nothing but cold, a frozen monument to what she had lost. The girl's simple observation was an absolution she had never expected, a key turning in a lock she had thought rusted shut forever. She looked at their faces, truly looked. She saw the determined set of Arthur's jaw, a perfect copy of Alistair's. She saw the deep, thoughtful blue of Beatrice's eyes, her own eyes staring back at her. And in Leo's shy, hesitant posture, she saw a reflection of the timid girl she herself had been before she had been forged into a duchess, and then broken, and then remade in this crucible of solitude. They were hers, and they were here. Mama? Leo whispered from the doorway, pulling his thumb from his mouth. The word was a question, fragile and full of a hope so immense it was terrifying. Before Elara could answer, before she could bridge the impossible chasm of 5 years with a single word, a shadow fell across the doorway. A man's voice, sharp with panic and threaded with authority, cut through the evening air. Arthur, Beatrice, Leo, for God's sake, where have you been? Elara's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was etched onto her bones, the soundtrack to both her greatest happiness and her most profound despair. She slowly, mechanically, pushed herself to her feet, using the back of her chair for support. She turned her head towards the door. There he stood, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. His hair was still the same shade of dark gold, but now threaded with silver at the temples. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by something more than time. He was dressed for travel, his greatcoat splattered with mud. But he still radiated the same effortless power, the same innate certainty that the world would bend to his will. His eyes, frantic with a father's fear, swept the cottage and then landed on her, and in that instant the world stopped. The color drained from his face. The panic in his expression was wiped away, replaced by a profound, bottomless shock that mirrored her own. He looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost, and in a way, he was. The woman he had condemned to social and emotional death was standing before him, breathing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Elara, he breathed. It was not a name, it was a prayer, a curse, an impossibility. The children, forgotten for a moment, looked back and forth between the two silent, warring adults. Arthur, ever the leader, stepped forward and took Ilara's rough hand in his small, soft one. He looked up at his father, his expression defiant. "We found her," he announced, his voice ringing with childish triumph. "She is going to be our mama." The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was filled with 5 years of unspoken words, of lies and betrayals, of a grief so deep it had shaped both their lives into unrecognizable things. Elara stood in her tiny, impoverished cottage, her calloused hand held by a son who did not know her, facing the husband who had destroyed her. The fire cracked in the hearth, a sharp, violent sound. The mending lay forgotten. A new, more terrible tear had been ripped in the fabric of her life, and she did not know if there was a needle strong enough or a thread fine enough to ever make it whole again. Alistair could not move. He could not breathe. The sight of her was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and the strength from his legs. Elara, alive. Her hair, once a complex coronet of braids and jewels, was now simply pulled back, a few errant strands framing a face that was thinner, sharper, but no less beautiful. Her eyes, the same impossible blue, held not the soft adoration he vaguely remembered, but a cold, hard fire he had never seen before. A fire of fury and of pain. For the past year, he had lived with the dawning, sickening horror of what he had done. It had started as a whisper of doubt, a question about the children's sadness, a nagging inconsistency in his cousin Ronan's smug reassurances. It had grown into a quiet investigation, led by a discreet solicitor named Davies, and had culminated in a single damning letter. A confession from the physician Ronan had paid, written on the man's deathbed and delivered a year too late. Every word had been a lash. Postpartum melancholy, a simple herbal tonic, enhanced to induce confusion, hysteria. Your Grace was convinced of her instability, for her own good and for the good of the children. He had not been protecting his children. He had been the gullible, arrogant instrument of his cousin's ambition. Ronan, ever the helpful, sympathetic relation, had seen his chance. With Elara declared mad and locked away, and the Duke lost in grief, his own influence would become paramount. Perhaps, if tragedy were to befall 3 small children. The thought was so monstrous, Alistair had nearly been sick. He had destroyed his wife. He had condemned the mother of his children based on the whispers of a viper and the performance of a paid actor in a physician's coat. The guilt was a physical entity, a cold, heavy weight that lived in his chest. He had uprooted his household, taking the children on a supposed tour of the country, leaving Ronan fuming back at a hollow Blackwood manor. It was a desperate flight, a hunt for a ghost, a penance he had only just begun. And now he had found her. Not in a sanitarium, not in a pauper's grave, but in a small, clean cottage in a village that smelled of salt and wood smoke, her hands raw from labor. She had survived him. She had survived his monstrous mistake. "Elara," he said again, taking a step into the cottage. The scent of the room hit him, not the cloying potpourri and beeswax of his own homes, but something real. Wood smoke, lavender, the faint, clean smell of drying wool. It was the scent of a life she had built from the ashes of the one he had burned to the ground. She recoiled as if he were a leper. She pulled her hand from Arthur's grasp and took a step back, her spine ramming into the rough stone of the mantelpiece. "Get out," she said. Her voice was low, but it vibrated with a rage so pure and cold it was more terrifying than any scream. "Take them and get out of my home." The children flinched. Beatrice began to cry, soft, hiccuping sobs. Leo, who had been peeking around the doorframe, vanished. Alistair's heart, already a mangled ruin, tore further. He had brought his chaos into her sanctuary. "Please," he began, his own voice sounding alien to him. "Just let me explain. I know what I did." "Do you?" Her laugh was a brittle, horrifying sound. "Do you know what it is to have your mind stolen from you? To be told you are mad by the one person who swore to protect you? To be dragged from your home, from your babies, while your husband stands by and watches?" Each question was a perfectly aimed dart, and he had no shield. He deserved every single one. "I was a fool," he said, his voice raw. "I was deceived. By Ronan. He planned it all." Elara's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened into something akin to contempt. "And you, the great Duke of Blackwood, were his willing puppet. Do not shift your blame to Ronan. He may have held the strings, but your hands were the ones that cast me out." She was right. It was the truth he had been forced to face in the long, silent nights at inns across the country. His pride, his emotional indolence, his damnable trust in a man who envied him everything he had. He had created the vacuum that Ronan had so eagerly filled. He saw the flicker of movement near the doorway. Leo was peeking back in, his small face streaked with tears. Alistair knelt, ignoring the damp, dirty floor, ignoring his ducal dignity. He was no duke here. He was a penitent, a beggar. "Arthur, Beatrice, come here," he said softly. Beatrice ran to him, burying her face in his coat, her small body shaking with sobs. Arthur, however, stood his ground, his gaze fixed on Elara. "She is our mama," Arthur insisted, his voice wobbling. "I know she is." How? How could he possibly know? A ghost of a memory, an instinct, or just the desperate wish of a motherless child projected onto the first kind face he saw? "Yes," Alistair said, his own eyes finding Elara's over the top of Beatrice's head. "Yes, she is." The admission hung in the air. For the children, it was a confirmation of a miracle. For Elara, it was a trap. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the primal fear of a cornered animal. She was not just Mrs. Elise, the seamstress, anymore. He had named her. He had chained her to the past she had so desperately tried to escape. "You cannot stay here," she whispered, her voice shaking now, the anger giving way to the terror beneath. "You cannot do this to me. I have built a life here." "A life without your children," he countered, his voice gentle but firm. He had to make her see. He had to bridge this gulf. "A life without your name. A life built on a lie. Not your lie, Elara. Mine." He stood up, lifting the weeping Beatrice into his arms. "We are staying at the village inn, the King's Head. I will not force my way in here again, but we are not leaving Oakhaven, not without you." He looked at Arthur. "Come, son." Arthur's lower lip trembled. He looked from his father's strained face to Elara's closed, pale one. He took a hesitant step toward the door, then stopped, his small shoulders slumping in defeat. Alistair walked out of the cottage, carrying one child and leading the other, his heart a leaden weight. He did not look back. He could feel her eyes on him, a physical force burning into his spine. He had found her. He had told her the truth or the beginning of it, and he had been summarily and rightfully rejected. The door to the cottage closed with a quiet, final click. It sounded like a tomb being sealed. He stood in the muddy lane, the sea wind whipping at his coat, a sobbing child in his arms and a silent, accusing one at his side. He had found the ghost he was hunting. Now he had to find a way to convince her to live again, and he had no idea how. The cottage was silent again, save for the fire and the frantic beating of Elara's own heart. The scent of them lingered. The faint, clean smell of soap and wool, the ghost of a little girl's tears. She sank into her chair, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her mending lay on the floor where it had fallen, a dark, forgotten heap. They were here, her babies. Not babies anymore, but children with thoughts and voices and heartbreakingly formal manners, and he was here, Alistair, the architect of her ruin, now claiming to be a victim himself. I was deceived. The words echoed in the suffocating quiet. It was a coward's excuse, an abdication of responsibility. And yet, there had been something in his eyes. Not the cold certainty of the man who had condemned her, but a haunted, broken desperation. The silver in his hair, the lines on his face. He had not been living in peace. A knock, soft and hesitant, came at the door, her whole body tensed. Had he come back? "Elise, are you all right in there, dear?" It was Mistress Gable, the owner of the boarding house where Elara had first found refuge, and the closest thing she had to a friend. Her voice was a balm of sturdy, no-nonsense kindness. Elara forced herself to her feet and opened the door. The older woman stood there, a shawl wrapped around her ample shoulders, her face creased with concern. "I saw the Duke's children at your door," she said in a low voice, her sharp eyes scanning Elara's pale face. "And then His Grace himself. There's a panic down at the inn. Thought the little ones were lost for good." Elara just stared at her, unable to form words. Mistress Gable's expression softened. She had never pried, had never asked about the shadows in Elara's eyes or the gentlewoman's accent she tried so hard to hide. She had simply offered a room, then a cottage, and a quiet, unshakable friendship. "Come now," the older woman said, bustling inside and closing the door firmly behind her. "You're as white as a sheet. I'll put the kettle on. Whatever storm has just blown into your house, we'll face it with a cup of tea." As the familiar ritual of tea-making filled the small space, Elara found her voice. She told her everything. The dam of 5 years of silence broke and the story poured out of her. The cold marriage, the whispers of his cousin, the birth of the triplets, the cloying scent of the tonic, the public hysteria, the cold finality in Alistair's eyes. She spoke of the carriage, the desperate escape in the dead of night, the long walk that had led her, penniless and broken, to Oak Haven. Mistress Gable listened without interruption, her hands busy with the teapot and cups, her expression grim. When Elara finally fell silent, exhausted and hollowed out, the older woman placed a steaming cup into her trembling hands. "So the man is a fool," Mistress Gable said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "A rich, powerful, and catastrophically blind fool. But the question is, Elise, or Elara, is he still a fool?" Elara looked into her cup, watching the steam curl and vanish. "He says he knows the truth now. He blames his cousin. As well he should, from the sound of it. But he's right. The blame lies with him. He held the power," she said. Then her voice softened. "But those children, Elara, those children are innocent in all of this. They are your flesh and blood, and they have been raised by a ghost. They looked at you and saw a mother. A fool of a father they may have, but their hearts are true." The words struck home. The children. Arthur's defiant declaration, Beatrice's simple, profound observation, Leo's hopeful, whispered, "Mama." They had not seen a duchess or a seamstress. They had seen a space in their lives, a mother-shaped hole, and she had fitted perfectly. "What do I do?" Elara whispered, the question she had been screaming internally for the last hour. "He says they are not leaving." "Then you have a choice," Mistress Gable said, her gaze steady. "You can bar the door and pray they go away, or you can open it a crack, not for the Duke, for them, for those 3 little ones who crossed a village to ask a stranger to be their mother." The next morning, Elara did not open her door. She sat at her small window, the curtain pulled back just enough to see the lane. She watched as a carriage, far too grand for Oak Haven, pulled up in front of the inn. A man in a severe black coat got out. Mr. Davies, the solicitor, she presumed, Alistair's proof. She felt a bitter surge of anger. He thought he could fix this with paperwork, with evidence. As if a confession on a piece of paper could erase the scars on her soul, could give her back the 5 years she had spent grieving for children who were alive, for a life that had been stolen. Later she saw them. Alistair, walking with the children along the path that led to the sea cliffs. He kept a careful distance from her cottage. The children, however, kept looking back, their small faces turned towards her window. Beatrice raised her hand in a small, hopeful wave. Elara let the curtain fall. She did not see them for 2 days. The village buzzed with gossip about the handsome, sad duke and his motherless children, and the quiet seamstress he seemed to be watching. He made no move to approach her again, but she felt his presence like a change in the weather. He was a storm waiting offshore, a pressure building in the air. On the third day, a small formal note was delivered by the innkeeper's boy. "I have brought evidence, proof of what was done to you. To us, I will not show it to you unless you ask. I only ask that you will see the children. They talk of no one else. They are not props in my atonement. They are boys and a girl who need their mother. He has forbidden me from bringing them to your door, so I ask, will you meet us? On the beach by the old pier this afternoon. They will be there, whether you come or not. Yours, Alistair. Yours." The word was a mockery. She was not his, she was her own, forged in fire and solitude, but the children, they are not props in my atonement. Had he read her mind? Was this a flicker of true understanding? She spent the rest of the morning in a state of war with herself. Her heart, the raw, wounded part of her, screamed at her to burn the note, to bar the door, to protect the fragile peace she had bought at such a high price. But the mother in her, a force she had thought long dead but had been resurrected by 3 small whispers, urged her toward the sea. At the appointed hour, clad in her plainest grey dress and a thick wool shawl, she walked toward the beach. The sky was overcast, the sea a sheet of churning pewter. From a distance she saw them, 3 small figures in dark coats running along the tide line, their laughter carried towards her on the wind. Alistair stood further back near the crumbling pylons of the old pier, a solitary, watching figure. As she drew closer, he saw her. He did not move, did not gesture. He simply stood and waited, giving her the space she needed. It was a small act of deference, but it was more consideration than he had shown her in the last year of their marriage. It was Beatrice who saw her first. The little girl stopped, her hand pointing. "Papa, it's the lady!" Arthur and Leo stopped their game, their heads swiveling towards her. For a moment, they were all frozen. The Duke, the seamstress, the 3 children who were the bridge and the chasm between them. Then Arthur began to run, not towards Alistair, but towards her. He ran with the clumsy, joyful abandon of a child, his little legs pumping, a wide grin spreading across his face. "You came," he shouted, his voice bright against the roar of the waves. He reached her and threw his arms around her waist, burying his face in the rough wool of her dress. A second later, Beatrice was there, her small hand finding Ilara's. Leo followed more slowly, his thumb in his mouth, but his eyes were shining. Ilara stood stiffly for a moment, a creature of ice in the face of so much warmth. Then, slowly, tentatively, her hand came up and rested on Arthur's head, her fingers sinking into his soft, dark hair. It was so familiar, a memory not of the mind, but of the body, of holding a tiny 6-month-old baby, his head fitting perfectly in the palm of her hand. A sob, dry and ragged, escaped her lips. The ice around her heart did not melt, it shattered. She sank to her knees in the damp sand, pulling them close, all 3 of them. She buried her face in the chaotic warmth of their small bodies, inhaling the scent of sea salt and childhood. She was not pretending anymore. She was remembering. From his position by the pier, Alistair watched. He did not intrude. He did not dare. This moment was not for him. It was sacred. It was the first stitch in a tapestry he had torn to shreds. He watched as the woman he had wronged, the woman he still loved with a desperate, aching intensity, knelt in the sand and wept for the children she had finally found again. This was his penance. To stand on the outside, a ghost at the reunion of his own family. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was only the beginning. Days bled into a strange new rhythm. Each afternoon, Ilara would meet the children on the beach or in the small windswept churchyard. Alistair was always there, a distant, silent guardian. He never approached unless invited. He never spoke to her unless a child's question required it. He gave her space, and in doing so, he paradoxically made his presence more powerful. His quiet, constant vigil was a testament to a patience she never knew he possessed. The children were the bridge. Through them she learned of the 5 years she had missed. They spoke of Blackwood Manor as a place of echoing silence, of nannies who were kind but busy, of a father who was sad and distant. "Papa works too much," Arthur confided one afternoon as they built a fortress of sand and seaweed. "He has sad eyes." "He doesn't know how to plait hair," Beatrice added, touching the neat braids Ilara had woven for her that morning. "Nanny Fitzwilliam tried, but she pulls." Ilara's heart ached. She was piecing together a portrait of a lonely, motherless life, presided over by a grieving, guilt-ridden man. The man she hated was also the father who had stayed, who had not abandoned his children, even if he had been emotionally absent. The two images warred within her. One evening, as twilight settled over the sea, Alistair approached her as the children were gathering shells at the water's edge. He held a small, oilskin-wrapped package. "Davies brought this from London," he said, his voice low. He did not try to hand it to her. He placed it on a dry piece of driftwood between them. "It's the physician's letter and Ronan's correspondence, detailing the payments. It's all there." Elara looked at the package, then at him. "And what do you expect this to do, Your Grace?" she asked, the formal title a deliberate barrier. Pain flickered in his eyes. "I expect it to do nothing for your heart, Elara. That, I know, is a wound that paper cannot heal. I brought it only so you would have the truth, so you would know that your madness was a poison, administered by a man who wanted my fortune, and enabled by a husband who was too proud and blind to see the wife in front of him." He turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Why now, Alistair? After 5 years, why start looking for the truth now?" He stopped, his back to her. The setting sun cast his long shadow across the sand towards her. "Because they started asking questions I could not answer," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Beatrice asked me what your favorite color was. Arthur asked if you liked to read. Leo asked if you were sad in the sky. I looked at the three of them, and I saw you. And I realized the lies I had been told, the lies I had told myself, were a flimsy dam against a tidal wave of grief. I had to know what really happened, for them, and for my own soul, what is left of it." He walked away then, leaving her with the package and his confession. She did not open it. She did not need to. For the first time, she had heard not the Duke of Blackwood, but Alistair, the man, broken and repentant. The next day, a storm rolled in from the sea, trapping the village in a torrent of wind and rain. There would be no meeting on the beach. Elara found herself pacing the confines of her small cottage, the silence once a comfort, now a cage. She missed them. The realization was as shocking as it was undeniable. She missed their laughter, their questions, their chaotic, vibrant presence. A frantic knocking shattered the afternoon quiet. It was not Mistress Gable. It was Alistair. He was soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face ashen with fear. "It's Leo," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe for support. "He has a fever. The village doctor is away. He's calling for you." Without a second thought, Elara grabbed her heaviest shawl and followed him out into the deluge. The inn was a flurry of hushed panic. Servants scurried with towels and basins. She ignored them all, following Alistair up the stairs to the ducal suite. The room was large and opulent, but it felt cold and sterile. In the center of a vast four-poster bed, Leo lay, a small, flushed figure lost in a sea of white linens. Beatrice and Arthur sat huddled on a window seat, their faces pale with worry. Elara went to the bed. Leo's skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and rapid. He tossed his head on the pillow, muttering her name. Mama, cold. The years of anger, of bitterness, of carefully nurtured resentment melted away in the face of a mother's primal fear. This was her child, her baby, and he was sick. "Cold water and cloths," she ordered, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the panicked indecision in the room. "And a basin, now." Alistair, who had been standing frozen and useless, snapped into action, relaying her orders to a waiting maid. For the next several hours, the grand suite at the King's Head became Elara's domain. She worked with a focused, desperate energy. She bathed Leo's forehead, forced sips of water between his cracked lips, and spoke to him in a low, soothing murmur, telling him stories of brave sailors and magical sea creatures. Alistair was her shadow. He did not direct or command. He served. He held the basin. He fetched fresh water. He sat with the other two children, his voice a low rumble as he tried to comfort them. He watched Elara, his expression a mixture of awe, hope, and profound shame. He was seeing the Duchess he had never known, the woman of strength and competence that had been hidden beneath the quiet, timid girl he had married. Night fell. The storm raged on. The fire was the only light in the room, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The other two children had fallen asleep in a heap on a large armchair. Alistair stood by the window, staring out at the black, rain-lashed glass. Elara sat by the bed, her hand resting on Leo's chest, feeling the steady, reassuring rise and fall of his breathing. The fever had broken. His skin was cool, his sleep peaceful. "Thank you," Alistair said from the window, his voice barely a whisper. Elara did not look up. He is my son. He would not be without you. I would have lost him. He turned from the window and she saw the glistening tracks of tears on his cheeks. The great Duke of Blackwood was weeping. I would have failed him, just as I failed you. He crossed the room and knelt by her chair. It was a shocking gesture. A duke kneeling to a seamstress. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently touch the edge of the blanket covering Leo. I found your wedding ring, he said, his voice ragged. The day after you left, it was on my desk. I have carried it with me every day for 5 years. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. Her ring, it glinted in the firelight. He held it out on the palm of his hand. It was not a demand, it was an offering, a symbol of everything they had lost and a question of what could be rebuilt. I threw away a life with you, Elara, a life with my own children, for pride, for foolishness. I can never give you back those 5 years. I can never undo the pain I caused. But I am asking, begging, for a chance to build a new life, not as a duke and his duchess, but as Alistair and Elara, as a father and a mother, together. She looked from the ring to his tear-streaked face to the 3 sleeping children who were the living, breathing consequences of their shared past. Forgiveness was not a single act, she knew. It was a choice made over and over again. It was a long, hard road, and she did not know if they would reach the end. But as she looked at her sleeping son, his life a fragile flame she had helped to shield from the storm, she knew she could not walk that road alone anymore, and she did not want to. Slowly, she reached out her hand, not for the ring, not yet. She placed her rough, calloused fingers over his, covering the hand that held the symbol of their broken past. Get some sleep, Alistair, she whispered, her voice weary but clear. The morning will be here soon, and we have work to do. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. It was the first glimmer of dawn after a long, dark night, and for now, it was enough. The return to Blackwood Manor was nothing like her arrival as a bride years ago. Then she had been met with a line of servants, a cold, perfunctory welcome from her new husband, and the suffocating weight of centuries of tradition. Now she arrived in a plain travelling carriage, with Alistair beside her, and 3 sleeping children tucked under blankets in the opposite seat. There was no fanfare. Alistair had sent word ahead, no staff lineup, no formal reception, just a quiet return home. Yet, stepping across the threshold was one of the hardest things Elara had ever done. The great hall, with its cold marble floors and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, was a mausoleum of memory. She could almost see the ghost of her younger self, timid and lost, wandering through these cavernous rooms. She could almost hear the echo of Ronan's poisonous whispers. I know this is difficult, Alistair said softly, sensing her hesitation. He had not let go of her hand since they had left Oakhaven. If you want, we can have it all changed. We can tear down the portraits, burn the furniture. We can start anew. Elara looked up at the portrait of Alistair's grandfather, a man renowned for his ruthlessness. No, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. We don't run from the past, Alistair. We make peace with it. But, she added, a small smile touching her lips for the first time, that ghastly green vase in the drawing room must go. A laugh, a real, genuine laugh, escaped him. It was a sound she had not heard in years, and it was more beautiful than she remembered. Consider it done. The first few weeks were a delicate dance. Elara was not the Duchess of Blackwood, not yet. She was Mrs. Elise, the children's governess, a fiction they maintained for the sake of the staff and, more importantly, for themselves. It gave her space, it gave them time. She took a suite of rooms adjoining the nursery, turning it into a warm, lived-in space filled with books, sewing baskets, and the scent of lavender. She was reclaiming the house, 1 room at a time. Alistair kept his promise of penance. He had dealt with Ronan before they returned. His cousin, faced with irrefutable proof of his crimes, including fraud and attempted conspiracy to harm the ducal heirs, had been stripped of his titles and income and now faced the prospect of transportation. Blackwood was free of his shadow. Alistair's atonement now took a quieter, more domestic form. He ceded the running of the household to her, not as a duty, but as a right. He consulted her on estate matters, listening to her practical, clear-sighted advice. She had learned much about hardship and economy in Oakhaven, and her perspective was invaluable. He was not just handing over power, he was acknowledging her competence, the strength he had once been too blind to see. Most importantly, he courted her. Not with jewels or grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts of love. He brought her the first snowdrop from the garden. He read to her by the fire in the evenings after the children were asleep. He learned with painstaking effort how to plait Beatrice's hair, presenting his lopsided, clumsy efforts to Elara with a hopeful, boyish grin that made her heart ache. He was showing her, not telling her, that he had changed. He was not the arrogant, detached duke anymore. He was Alistair, a man humbled by his mistakes, a father besotted with his children, and a husband desperate to earn back his wife's love. The turning point came on a crisp spring afternoon. Elara was in the garden, a place she had once avoided, now her favorite sanctuary. She was teaching the children the names of the flowers when Alistair appeared, a small worn leather-bound book in his hand. "This was my mother's," he said, handing it to her. It was a journal. "She loved this garden. She wrote about it. I thought you might like to read it." Elara opened the book. On the first page, in a delicate, fading script, was an entry about planting the rose bushes that now climbed the garden wall. As she read, she came across a passage that made her catch her breath. "Alistair is so like his father," his mother had written. "Proud, serious, and with a tendency to trust the wrong people. I pray he finds a wife strong enough to see through his walls, to anchor his heart, and to save him from his own worst instincts. He will need a partner, not a decoration." She looked up at Alistair, who was watching her, his expression vulnerable. He had read this, he knew. "She saw you, Elara," he said, his voice thick. "All those years ago, she was writing about you." In that moment, the last of the ice around her heart melted. The ghost of the timid girl she had been finally faded, replaced by the woman she was now, strong, resilient, and loved. Loved not for her title or her beauty, but for her spirit. She closed the journal and stood up. She walked over to him, her gaze never leaving his. "My favorite color is blue," she said softly, "the color of the sea at dawn. I love to read, especially poetry, and I was never sad in the sky. I was just waiting." He understood. His eyes, the sad eyes his son had described, filled with a light she had only dreamed of seeing again. He reached into his pocket and drew out the simple gold band. This time, he did not offer it. He took her left hand, the hand with the calloused fingertips and the faint scars from her needle, and slid the ring into its rightful place. It was a perfect fit. "Elara Beaumont," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of his love and relief. "My wife, my duchess, my heart." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound homecoming. It was a promise, a prayer, and a new beginning, all in one. That evening, the grand dining room at Blackwood Manor remained dark. Instead, a small table was set by the fire in the nursery. The Duke and Duchess of Blackwood sat on the floor, eating stew from simple earthenware bowls, laughing as their 3 children put on a chaotic, rambling play about a brave seamstress, a sad king, and 3 lost little birds who found their way home. The firelight danced on their faces, chasing away the last of the shadows. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with laughter, with stories, with life. Elara looked at Alistair, her husband, her partner, the father of her children. He caught her eye and smiled, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. The mending was done. The torn fabric of their lives had not just been patched, it had been rewoven, stronger and more beautiful than before, threaded through with the gold of forgiveness and the silver of a hard-won, enduring love. She was home.